Welcome back to Season 2 of Defence Talk, Securing UK Advantage, a podcast brought to you by the Council on Geostrategy in partnership with trade association ADS Group and sponsored by industry powerhouse BAE Systems. This season, we continue to explore the key questions that shape defence, technological and national security agendas in the UK and unpack the main themes in British defence as geopolitical competition intensifies. And today, we have a very timely and a hot question to address. How can we strengthen UK defence and security through financing and investment? I'm Viktorija Starych-Samuolienė, co-founder at the Council on Geostrategy, and as always, I'm here today with my colleague Paul Mason.
Great to be here, Victoria. And there's a lot happened
There's
since
a
last
lot
time
to
we've been.
unpack,
Yeah, the
indeed.
National Security Strategy, your own Defence Economic Growth Task Force with the CBI, and Britain has joined the NATO nuclear mission. And on the day we're recording this, I think there's an announcement again from the Prime Minister that Britain and France will effectively pool their deterrence in certain situations. So lots to talk about.
Loads to talk about indeed. But today, let's try to concisely focus on a couple of questions. Let's provide an overview of defence, financial and related professional services industries, and discuss how they interact with one another. Let's also try to unpack the main challenges, including the accessibility of essential financial services providers and the importance of investor confidence in the defence industry. And also, let's try to examine the opportunities in defence financing and investment in the years ahead to enable our country to rearm efficiently. And we are, of course, absolutely delighted to be joined by our two expert guests, Rob Murray, Chief Executive Officer at Defence Security and Resilience Bank, who's joining us online today, and Aimie Stone, Chief Economist at ADS Group. So Rob Murray is Chief Executive Officer at the Defence Security and Resilience Bank, and he was the founding architect of Diana and the NATO Innovation Fund, while serving as the first head of innovation at NATO. At NATO, he spent nearly a decade in the defence investment team, working closely with national armaments directors, and he has also served as Chief Innovation Officer at SAB, is a fellow at MIT and Imperial College London, and a professor at Johns Hopkins University.
And Aimie, welcome. Aimie Stone is Chief Economist at the ADS Group and has been at ADS for over 6 years in a cross-sector role. Aimie leads on providing evidence to policy issues, including tax and supply chain impacts. Her work has a focus on providing evidence and addressing policy needs to ensure greater support for the UK's industrial base. Aimie is also on the Secretariat of the UK Aerospace Industry Customs Group within ADS membership and has previously worked for trade bodies. And I think, Aimie, you've spent the last 5 out of the last 6 years working on access to finance for ADS members, and recently we're involved in producing with the CBI the Defence and Economic Growth Task Force. So we've got two guests well poised to just answer some of the most basic questions.
And not only basic questions, more complex ones as well.
I've only got basic ones.
Well, let's start perhaps with a relatively simple one. And Rob, thank you so much for joining us today. We are delighted to have you with us. And I guess it would be a good idea to just try to map out who are those stakeholders when it comes to defence financing and defence investment.
Oh, Victoria, thanks very much. And thank you to Paul as well for both of you having me. I think that when we look at defence investment, and those words are important, right? Because we're not really in the business now of defence spending. It's about defence investment. There's a difference. And so the point is, when we kind of map this, we need to think of this as like a defence capital stack. And I would argue that in recent years, there's been a lot of focus at the bottom of that stack with regards to venture capital coming into the defence space. And that's good. You need that. You need that for those innovative companies that are going to drive the emerging technologies, right? No question. But equally, there's a place for private equity. There's a place for commercial banks. There's a place for national banks. And then above all of that, there's a place for multilateral banks. And at the moment, we haven't really got that capital stack in place. We haven't really got it functioning as it should be. And there's lots of reasons we can get into as to why that's the case. But I think the takeaway point is that, what are we actually trying to do here? Why do we even need this defence investment? It's worth just remembering. And I'm sure, Aimie will have views on this as well with the excellent CBI report that came out. So this is about deterrence. We're no longer in peacetime. All of our financial rules, our regulations, our ways of working, our entire architecture for really sort of finance in this area were written in an era that no longer exists. And therefore, we've got to reflect the geopolitical reality as to where we are today and have that embedded in our financial architecture. We're going to have to redraw that. And this is all about making sure, very simply, in very simple terms, I also like simple questions and simple answers, in the match that we need armaments in our national inventories to deter Russia. That's specifically a European perspective, and I mean the continent of Europe there. Obviously, China's a slightly more complicated case, for Europe at least. But that's what this is about. It's no more complicated than that. And like all sorts of conflicts in history, one has to understand the financial flows, where the credit's going to come from, and how this all stitches together. So as a very sort of big picture overview, we must be clear-sighted as to what we're trying to do, and we must build that capital stack, to allow for those armaments to be part of that deterrence. And actually, what this really means is it really means doing something we haven't probably done before, and utilizing something what I'll call capital market deterrence as well.
So, Aimie, I'm wondering if you could just throw more light on that. What for your members are the typical obstacles and barriers to gaining access to finance? I mean, we're not only talking about your members, because we need to talk about banks, we need to talk about, as you say, PE, we need to talk about VCs, but for the defence and dual use firms themselves, what is the problem?
I think it builds slightly on what's already been articulated. It's quite a busy landscape, and different firms are in different places. I think one of the main messages that I've come to understand is that there's so many different types of firms, and especially with the changing nature of warfare, that's only going to accelerate, there's a lot of different requirements. So you have your Series B funding guys, and that's sort of been touched on, the VC, and that's all quite attractive. But actually, where we're headed, the new landscape that we're facing, there's a different need as well. It's about scale up, not in startup scale up, but scale up in a sense of capacity scale up. That's still a very true need. Alongside that, long-term investment deterrence type of funding that also exists. So you almost have like three kinds of requirements from the outset. And if you're a firm that's been working in the industry a long time, you might understand quite well how the MOD spending landscape works, but do you necessarily understand about the private side of things as much? Maybe yes, maybe no. But contracts haven't been great for a little while either. Procurement reform's essential to this whole conversation. And one thing that really struck out for me actually during the conversations, I don't think it made the cut of the report, but we had the finance guys say to us as well, well, we don't know where to go to work with you. So it's almost that we're not knocking at the same front door. Don't even think we're living on the same street sometimes when it comes to defence and finance. We agree on the importance of doing the right thing, and everybody wants to be there, but it hasn't quite married up of people knowing where to go. And that is a job for us all to do, I think. The trade body definitely can take some accountability there.
And I suppose, putting it very simply, what finance is in risk reward. I mean, they're just basically trying to calculate the risk of the investment and work out what the reward should be. And one of the conversations I've had with the MOD during the drawing up of the defence industrial strategy is, look, if, Rachel Reeves's basic philosophy is de-risk private investment through regulatory change, through certainty, through long-termness. But if all the MOD then does is re-risk it by its own behaviour, through its short-term contracts, lumpy cash flow, feast-famine procurement cycles, how much of this is ultimately the banks looking at the MOD's behaviour through the prism of the defence firms and saying, look, they've just got the ultimate dodgy client?
So government as a customer and the culture within how things are procured and that piece is absolutely fundamental, not only to the report, but also the wider ADS work that we've been doing. And I actually can't speak highly enough of colleagues in the civil service that we've worked with in recent months on all of this, and understanding that actually, yes, some of this is risky, but if your adversaries are willing to take that risk, you need to as well. And so that we need to get behind that more too. I think the way that Commercial X is handling some of this is incredibly exciting, and that is the bit of procurement that is willing to take more risk, and we should see the payoff. A better environment where companies are encouraged to do some test and fail is great. But I am with you that ultimately one of the sticking points is it's a commercial interest, especially to a bank. Recommendation one here is get a clear demand signal in place. And I think we're getting there. I think that the SDR goes some way to that, but we do need the defence industrial strategy as well. This government's entire kind of position has been about picking winners and mission-led growth. So let's do that for defence as well. And I think if we do that, that will help because that gives the market the clear signal it needs. And they've said that.
Aimie, you've referred to the SDR, and of course SDR has been published recently. And Rob, I recall that Australia published their version of SDR in 2024, and it interestingly came together with an additional document called an Integrated Investment Plan, which offered to set out budget allocation estimates for various elements of that strategy, national defense strategy. But I don't think, well, our SDR has featured anything of that sort substantially enough. Why do you think this is the case, and how can we overcome this problem?
So this, I think there's touching on some points here, which goes back to Paul's question previously, and what you just described there, Victoria. So let's kind of unpack this a little bit. What are we actually trying to do here when it comes to government and the way in which they buy stuff, they acquire stuff? Well, there has to be far greater confidence in how that entire process works. At the moment, it's really unclear in the United Kingdom as to what the defense budget's going to be spent on. So whilst I've spent a lot of time working in the United States in my career, I've studied there as well and lived there. And whilst the Department of Defense in the US is by no means a panacea in terms of its process, the Pentagon is incredibly challenging as well for getting things done. I think one thing the United States does very well is every year it releases what's called the National Defense Authorization Act. And what that is literally a line-by-line document. It's a very large document. It's a line-by-line as to pretty much where the entire defense budget for the following year is going to be spent. And that then has to be approved by Congress. And so you've then got, you talk about demand signals, you've got incredibly clear demand signals because it's explicit. Right? Obviously, some of the incredibly sensitive projects and money, that's obviously not in there because it's a public document. But for probably 90-95% of the budget, line by line, here's where it's going. And actually, our Congress in the United States says, please, can you approve this? That to me, whilst it's a painful process, and of course it's open to political maneuvering, and you get things like congressional ads where politicians wish to add things in that are pertinent to their district. Overall, it's a pretty good system. And so I think there's the benefits of that should be absolutely absorbed in how the UK does things. Because at the moment, the way the United Kingdom does its budgeting for defence is a million miles away from that. And it's very opaque and therefore difficult to interpret. And so going back to the point about Australia, of course, why wouldn't you create a explanation as to how you're going to finance your defense strategy? If we're in business, any sort of business plan and strategy, which strategy is just a plan at the end of the day, any sort of plan, if it doesn't have resources next to it, then it's just a wish. Right? So to me, this is just good. This is just good sense. It's just good governance. And I think it's perhaps more telling when you can't apply resources next to your strategic ambitions. Again, going back to what I said right at the beginning, this is all about deterrence. This is all about signaling. This is all about language with Moscow, with Beijing, with Tehran, with others. And it really undermines our deterrence if we put out these grandiose statements of what it is we wish to try and buy, the way in which we wish to try and operate, if we then don't have the resources to back it up. And that's my fear that may well occur with regards to the 5% of GDP commitment for NATO, split between 3.5% for defence, 1.5% for resilience, is if we repeat what we did from 2014, when the commitment back then at the NATO summit in Wales was 2%, with a decade to get there, and most nations didn't do it. If we repeat that, that totally undermines the political credibility of what one is trying to achieve with regards to Russia, or with regards to deterrence writ large. So this is hugely important to get defence financing and defence investment right, because it sends all sorts of signals for all sorts of people around the world.
So if we look at this from the point of view of the banks, as you say, the stack itself, everybody from VCs, commercial banks, central banks, from their point of view, what is the obstacle to investment? Because there's a kind of folklore that says it's all about ESG, and that investment funds and pension funds just are too hidebound by ESG. When you speak to people on that side, they will tend to say, actually, it's just risk. It's just the Basel III regulations, which don't exactly apply in this country, but effectively do. That Basel III just made capital risk averse, full stop, and that we're a risky sector, and so we're just getting the sharp end of that. What's your view on what's the real problem?
So, as I've been hearing this a lot as well from industry to say, we've had debanking be a topic of conversation. There was an email in my inbox just this week saying an insurance firm had declined to work with a company owing to their activities in defence. And I will be honest, that one has sort of tapered off a little bit in recent months. I think what's happened with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and all of the changes around that has swayed that public perception and that narrative somewhat. But what we do know is that banks and finance providers have their own policies around what they will and won't work with. 9 times out of 10, I think we find it's more of an ethical reasoning than an ESG reasoning. I mean, we really welcomed the statement that the FCA put out saying there should not be an ESG reason why firms should not work in defence. However, it is up to you if you can choose to work with who you want to or not. So that helps. We've been through quite a lot of sort of investors, private finances, high street lenders, policies on defence to try to understand what it is. And sometimes I found there's quite broad terms around what they will and won't touch within the defence work, but that's better than sometimes just like not working with it at all. Blanket phrases don't help. Perception of that doesn't help. But I think you're right, what we were saying earlier, that overall demand signal of, is this a good return on investment? If our own government and kind of chancellor and spending and everything and that can't see it, how do we expect the private market to? So that's really been the nature of the changing conversation in really recent months for me, is we need the strong demand signals to sort of encourage everybody else along and de-risk defence.
Yeah, maybe I can just build on Amy's points here. I mean, look, when you look at the legislative implications of commercial banks in the United Kingdom lending to defence companies, there is no legislative reason why banks can't do this, right? So there's no laws preventing this. However, there are, of course, and this is applicable to all sectors, not just defence, compliance risk, credit risk, reputational risk, which is applicable, to everyone. And whilst, Paul, you rightly mentioned Basel III, of course, every good policy needs a sequel, and Basel IV is coming, and for the United Kingdom, that's due to come into effect on the 1st of January 2027. Now, Basel IV is really, really going to make it problematic for banks to be British banks, and EU banks as well, actually, to be able to lend to defence companies. What it's going to do is it's going to force those banks to hold more capital against those loans, even when their internal models suggest the risk is low. And so what that means is lending to defence firms is going to become really more expensive and less commercially attractive, precisely when lending is going to be needed. And I'll unpack that again, in a moment. And the problem here is structural. Banks can no longer fully rely on their own risk models, and they're going to have to use stricter standardized rules that will penalize certain sectors. That's what Basel IV is. And for listeners that are not familiar with this comes from the Bank of International Settlements, international organizations set up after World War One, and the UK signed up to this, broadly speaking. And so what does all this mean? How do we deal with this? When we think about that defence stack, multilateral bank at the top, national banks underneath, commercial banks, private equity, venture capital, top to bottom, what we're going to have is a multilateral bank which is geared exactly for defence, and part of its function is to provide guarantees to commercial banks to help underwrite this risk such that they can genuinely lend, not necessarily to the defence primes, not necessarily to the British Aerospaces and the Rolls-Royces of the world, because their ability to raise capital is relatively straightforward, but actually down that supply chain, down all the way the tier 2, the tier 3 to tier 4, the small entities, because it's those entities that need invoice financing, supply chain financing, working capital, overdrafts, basic financial services. And with Basel IV coming in 18 months' time, unless there is an institution like the one I'm working on, the Defence Security Resilience Bank, to bring about those guarantees underwritten by sovereign states, this problem is absolutely going to be exacerbated.
Something that you just mentioned there, Rob, I think it's pertinent me to mention, it's the makeup of industry as well that kind of makes this problem worse or exacerbates it to a degree. It is that there, as you mentioned, some of the primes, there's not that many. There's also even fewer mid-tiers, I'd say, but it's that long tail of SMEs actually who, when you think about it again from your commercial perspective of a bank, how do they know? And it also comes back to that really great point earlier about in the US, they get a long list of companies that would be. From the bank's perspective, they don't know one SME from another. So they're all treated with a higher level of risk in that sense. So what we feel we need to start doing from the defence side is bringing those companies more to the front, making them more visible to the market generally, and helping people that do have some money to back the industry to also identify that, because it's that nature. And I'm sure it will become more problematic with dual use as well, with emerging tech. And it's down to that point of, what do you know about that company to base your risk on? And if they're an emerging tech, a young company, or dual use, and they've not been in the space before, you don't know a lot. So the risk is higher, so it's less of a reasonable prospect.
And you've got the problem of scale. When I've spoken to VCs, they always say, well, if you were making, there is effectively no semaglutide for defence. Novo Nordisk added significant figures to Denmark's GDP simply by inventing a new drug, which can be sold all over the world. No matter what you invent in defence, you're not going to have the scale, especially the mid-sized country like Britain. So one question that follows that from that, for me, is whose problem is this in the British government? Because I know for a fact that the MOD gets this. How many conversations have we all had with them about this? But does the British Treasury get it?
I think so. I think this report that I'm waving around like my latest flag does sort of imply that, and great work to Oliver Wyman and CBI for leading that. But that was, the task was a sprint for 12 weeks. So it brought together the Treasury and the MOD. And as I say, I've been doing this for about 6 years now. That's the first time I've seen both in the room on this conversation. And that was quite groundbreaking in itself, the same banks and investors and defence industry in the same room. And that was great. And we don't want to let that go, because I think they do get it. But I think you keep doing that quite peasant, but they have to understand, or they want us to understand, that the public purse is only so big. Yeah. So the pound has to work for both of us. I think defence and security of the realm is top order of the day. I don't think, well, we're all going to agree, aren't we? But that's where we're agreeing on things here. But underneath that, the economy needs to grow. So are the investments being made in defence bringing in private capital? Are they, and if we do start doing that, are they facilitating exports to be able to sell and grow the industry? Are they creating jobs? And that's kind of the task that we have now. After the task was finished, the new task is to show that, because I think you're right. But in peacetime, you're not going to be able to prove that. So it's quite hard for me as the economist to go back and get the data and say, yeah, look, it's done this, because it's hard to show that. But what we can do is narrow it down, and there's some great case studies, and I think we know where they are in the country as well. But again, the government's idea to take a regional approach to things, that's going to help, because that will put a focus on it.
Rob, you run the Defence Security and Resilience Bank. How has this idea been received so far in the UK and also globally?
So Victoria, thank you. So what I've created is Defence Security Resilience Bank Development Group. So think of it as the incubator, if you will, for the bank. And this will be an international financial institution. So think like a World Bank for defence, but without Russia and China as shareholders for obvious reasons. So how has this been received? I would say having, when I first started this project 6 or 7 years ago, I was working at NATO. I was working on the Secretary General's political staff, so Jens Stoltenberg. I was running a team focused on defense investments, specifically on where nations were spending their money with regards to all of the land and maritime assets they're looking to invest in. And back then, during President Trump's first administration, it was all about, all right, nations, you've got to spend 2%. You've got to get there. It's got to happen. And in the building in Brussels, there was panic. People didn't know how to deal with this in terms of the not necessarily the message, because this message of American presidents coming to Europe and asking for more on defense is not new. This goes all the way back to Kennedy. He would come to NATO summits and say this. So this isn't a new message. But of course, it's the manner in which the message was delivered. So I started thinking like, well, can we think about money differently? Because when we think about defense and we think about defense spending, as opposed to investment, and we think about budgets, it's purely public money that's given to the Ministry of Defense from the Treasury, and it's normally a knife fight as to how much you get, and it is what it is. And that to me just feels very simplistic. And I just feel there are some sophisticated ways that could be applied to complement what already goes on. So to sort of fast forward, I started looking at other ways to think about this and ended up with, well, actually, what we need is a multilateral bank for defense to complement what nations are already doing. It's a tool which, otherwise wouldn't exist. And multilateral banks, as I've discovered over the last 6 or 7 years, are actually quite unique beasts. There's not really any other financial institutions that are like them. They're not really comparable to commercial banks, to be honest. And what makes them unique is that nation states are shareholders exclusively, so it's owned by sovereign states. They're not regulated. There's no national regulation over them. It's their governance charter and credit rating, which is a quasi sort of regulation, if you will. And because it's sovereign states that own these things, it means these banks can do all sorts of financial activities which commercial banks just simply cannot. So when you start to understand and unpack how these banks work, there's an awful lot of opportunity. The challenge with nations has been sort of threefold, and it goes back to the point about different parts of government sort of focusing on this. Very few people in governments across Europe, across North America, genuinely understand how multilateral banks work. And that's not to sound sort of arrogant from my perspective. It's just the nature of the beast. These are complicated things. Very few understand how they might work in the context of defense. So what's been the challenge over the last few years? I've been building this bank, the financial model, the manner in which it might operate, has been actually trying to explain the story, explain as to what this would do, and getting people to grasp that. That has not been easy, mainly because it cuts across multiple departments. It cuts across the Ministry of Defense. It cuts across the Finance Ministry. It cuts across the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and it will cut across the Prime Minister's office as well because of the scale of these things. So just the internal sort of coordination is very difficult. That said, it's clear to me, based upon where we are with regards to this project, the positive affirmation indeed in that CBI report that Aimie was alluding to for the Defence Security Resilience Bank, that we are going to see a multilateral defence bank. I'm highly, highly confident of that. Exactly what shape it takes, exactly its mandate, exactly the configuration of nations, that's to be confirmed. But we've had European MEPs pass a resolution in the European Parliament calling for the Defence Security Resilience Bank. We've had various ministers stand up in the House of Commons confirming that the British government is reviewing this. We've just had Rachel Reeves and John Healey endorse that CBI report that calls for the DSR Bank as well. So this is coming. It's going to come. I'm confident of that. But it's just been some hard yards in sort of educating people as to how it operates, its benefits, but also the fact that now is the time for these sorts of instruments.
So Aimie, Defence and Economic Growth Task Force report has just come out. What are the key takeaways?
So we have two foundational points in the report, which for me underpins the whole point of doing this, which is that piece around bringing back together Team UK or being Team UK. So that's the defence industry and the financial services and professional services industry being in the same room, plus the whole of government narrative as well. That's very much at the fundamental of how do we actually make an economic success of this? We've got to be on the same team. Fundamental point for the her whole piece. But prior to that, foundational point one is getting that demand signal correct. So I think as we've kind of spoken about, it is what's the money going to be spent on, where, when, but also where can we collaborate? What are we going to buy instead? And making sure that the whole of the defence industry knows what we're going to be good at and kind of gets on board with that. And that said, like that sort of encourages the markets to then follow. There's a phrase that's been used quite a lot throughout this kind of process of putting the report together, and it's that capital follows contracts. So we need to get the contracts right, whether they're ones with MOD, whether they're ones with primes for the supply chain, or whether they're export ones. But that's the theory. That's the theory we're running with. Capital follows contracts, all Team UK approach.
Why are we not getting that clear demand signal in your view?
Well, it's been 2 years since ADS first asked for an industrial strategy of sorts, and within that we meant a defence one as well. And I think it's the change in the government, it's the change in approach to all of this. I do mind because it has kept industry on a back burner and slightly on a waiting game to know about that clear demand signal. But I don't mind in a sense that the thinking is being done. So from the moment that the new government stepped into power, but also when they were in the shadow team, there was a lot of engagement with industry to understand where strengths were and what Team UK Defence can be doing. So I think there's been a lot of thinking going on, but we're ready for some action now. I think that we need the defence industrial strategy, and I underscore need, and the defence investment plan, formerly the defence equipment plan, to come with that. But the position of Andy Starr as the National Armaments Director, brilliant. He's got a clear plan, and he sort of reassured us at launch that about 80% of what this is asking of the government is now being embedded into what he's doing, because this has come first. So this isn't allowing government to think with industry, but now we need the action.
So we are waiting for the defence industrial strategy to be published. What are your expectations? What ideally would you like to see in it?
It's kind of what I just said, a little bit more detail around where the money will be spent, where the collaborations will happen, and where the UK will opt to buy things. We've made all the commitments around NATO and increasing that spending, identifying our allies. Paul mentioned as well the agreements with France and some of the bilaterals. And then let's see that in the proof of what we're going to do then. That's got to set that clear pathway for industry. And again, I think it's been said, look, the time of conflict gives you that pathway and that mandate to be operating in. It's not what any of us would want, but it is providing that signal for us to do.
And when it comes to defence financing and defence investment and the private stakeholders involved, what are the biggest opportunities for them to be engaged with the government?
It's, really interesting. I think not just isolated to the UK government. I think, as Rob sort of said, this is like a pan-European question
Yes.
at the heart of it. And okay, great. So what we've seen, some of the changes that have been happening at the European Investment Bank as well, where they've changed the scope of how people can work with the defence industry. That opens up to the whole private financing side of things, an opportunity to work closer through them. One option, not necessarily the best for the heart of the UK. So I get that. But the idea of pools of funding to help facilitate supply chain financing, we touched on it a little bit in here as well. Perfect, great. The idea around the accelerators that exist in defence, so DASA and NIF and NSIF, or the kind of companies and joint ventures that are happening there, they're really great things for private finance with a little bit more money to say, that company did well in the accelerator, can I back them? We have this challenge, and I sort of said earlier, there's a bit of a matrix of challenges where lots of different companies, lots of different kinds of businesses, lots of different financial needs now present in our industry, but lots of hands up offering to help with a lot of different solutions. So we need to do some matchmaking to enable that and to make it a success. But it's been said to me there isn't necessarily a problem of raising the capital, it's just raising it in the right place and making sure that the people or the companies that need it get it And then I think the kind of thing at the moment is, and quickly, at pace. It's all about pace at the moment as well, making sure that it's done right and gets to front lines what they need in the conflict that we're in.
Aimie, what's the one thing you want to see government do next? It's taking a series of steps, NSS, endorsing your report and the rest. What comes next in the policy timetable?
To be honest, I think it's kind of what Rob was saying at the start. It's telling us what the money is going to be spent on and actually spending it, if I'm allowed to say that as well, and spend it at pace. I think that's really what industry is holding its breath for slightly at the moment.
So
and
clear market signal.
That's what it delivers.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Let me just jump on that real quick. So sorry, just to jump on that point, because there's some great examples from Ukraine, all right? Ukraine's not a blueprint for the future, but there's definitely some signposts. Brave One, an entity that kind of connects front-end users with technology firms, just launched a marketplace about 2 months ago, like an Amazon marketplace, if you will. What they've done is they've decentralized procurement. So now troops down at platoon level can buy what they need. Obviously, you can't buy a ship or a submarine that way, of course not, but an awful lot of things you can do. And the benefit of that is, of course, if something doesn't work or isn't that good, then the 22-year-old corporal just gives it a 1-star review, and market forces kick in very fast. So that model should absolutely be examined properly in the UK, because there is a real opportunity to do exactly what Aimie said there in terms of moving fast. And you can do that through decentralization and empowerment to those at the front.
And the markets are watching that, right? Like, we know that the guys at the big banks are looking, the JV guys, they're all looking at that and thinking, okay, who's doing well? Where shall I put my money? So that crowds in all this capital that we're saying. And so that's how it should work. I'm with you there.
And just to finish this conversation, a question to both of you. What is the key action to be taken now to encourage private defense financing and investment? One, if you may.
Well, I think the investment of that it's coming. The pension funds, the insurance funds, they're all reallocating their capital for next year in 27, and they're all looking to get it into defence. You can see the banks are standing up their sort of defence team, and private equity shops are as well, in order to get create vehicles for this capital flow. That is, huge sums of money are coming into this sector. What needs to happen? I'm going to actually say it's going to be two things. Sorry. First is, going back to Amy's point earlier, rapid contracting. We've got to get contracts out from government. It's got to happen faster than it does at the moment. But second of all this money coming into the sector, unless companies can expand their operations, it will be inflationary. And therefore, you've got to be able to get credit down into those tier 2, 3, 4 supply chain firms so they can expand it. That can only happen with national banks and multilateral banks to provide guarantees.
And Aimie?
One thing's really hard, and I appreciate we're tight on time. So I think we're shifting the public narrative, and I think that's actually fundamental to a lot of this as well. That's kind of putting my economist hat back on for one moment and saying, how do we actually make sure that all the support is behind us to keep doing this? And I think that's probably it. We've gone some way. Like I said, some of the nature of the funds are starting to change how they're viewing this industry, and that's great, but more does need to be done, and that broader public support for our industry is definitely needed.
Those are great points.
Aimie, Rob, thank you so much for your time today and for joining us. And also, I would like to encourage all our listeners to download this report, which Aimie has referred multiple times to, and find additional information on this topic there. But thank you so much for joining us and for listening to Defence Talk, Securing UK Advantage. And until next time.
Goodbye.